Now, isn't that interesting? This person is Jewish. He is not a follower of Christ. And yet, he says, I am fearful of a society that abandons, Christianity, because there's no ideology, there's no way of thinking that supplants it that is good for humanity. The reason why so many things are confusing in society today is because we're leaving the source, or we have abandoned the source of our core values. This is Dennis Prager's point. He's frightened of a post-Christian society. What does post-Christian mean? Well, it means that it's after Christian. And so we no longer hold that as a source of core values. Welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. Today, how important are core values? What happens when you know what they are and you stick with them? What happens when you don't? I want to welcome you to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I am Douglas Peak, and I am the Salty Pastor. Something a little funny and interesting that I shared with you on Tuesday is that I am now trademarked as the Salty Pastor, and I just thought today I would even show you the trademark. So if you're watching on YouTube, then you'll be able to see that I'm holding up to the camera the Salty Pastor trademark from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I have no idea what the implications of all this are, but I thought it was kind of funny and that you should know. Now, I'm not trying to say I'm the only salty person out there. As a matter of fact, every follower of Christ should become salty. And the real question is, how do you get salty? Well, first you have to know what you believe and why you believe it. You can't just be a cultural Christian anymore. And that basically means someone who grew up being told they were a Christian and they were told what to believe, and you just accepted it with blind faith. Today, you have to make an intentional choice to clarify your beliefs. You have to say to yourself, I believe this because I know it's true. I've studied it, researched it, I've tested it, I've challenged it, and I've come to the conclusion that it is true. Now, on Tuesday, we asked a simple question, and that was, what do the following four things have in common? Joe Rogan interviews Wes Huff about the manuscript evidence for Christianity. Number two, what about the hostages in Israel? Number three, LA is on fire. Why is it on fire? Why are these fires so bad? Is it just a result of climate change or something else to blame? And four, what's happening in the inauguration? And why is it a big deal? The reason we ask these questions is because we delved into how they are examples of core values and why core values are so important. They illustrate what happens when you know what your core values are and you stick with them, and what happens when you don't. For instance, Joe Rogan rocketed to fame Wes Huff, who was an apologist. He's a young man who basically his focus is ancient manuscripts, documents of antiquity. I guess he's like the Indiana Jones of literature. And so he was interviewed by Joe Rogan, and he showed how the documents in the early manuscripts of Christianity are extremely significant. The amount of them is overwhelming, and they are highly accurate. And so Joe Rogan was astonished, and I believe it was challenging for him to have to deal with the fact that the New Testament, the whole Bible, but the New Testament in particular, is incredibly accurate, and it came from firsthand witnesses of Jesus Christ, what he taught, how he lived, what he said. Many of them were written within 30 years of his life. And so it's really quite fascinating. Now, how is it that Wes Huff was able to get on the #1 podcast in the world and share all of this incredible evidence about the authenticity of Jesus Christ? Well, the reason why is because he debated a man by the name of Billy Carson, who had been making claims that our Bible is untrustworthy, there are no manuscripts, they all contradict each other, Jesus was never crucified, never rose from the dead, blah, 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 blah. He had kind of created a little multimedia empire where he's making all kinds of money, going on podcasts and saying this kind of stuff. And so Wes Huff was invited to debate him, and in a very nice way, he basically dismantled this guy and exposed him as a fraud. And so Joe Rogan heard about this, and he invites him onto his podcast, and it becomes a credible opportunity to show that our Bible and Jesus was real. What he taught was real. Now, whether you believe it or not is a different question, but the thing you can't say is that he wasn't crucified, that he didn't exist, that these things are fakes, or it's mythology that's been copied and recopied and copied and recopied. People who say that are just plain ignorant. What we have today is so close and so accurate to what was written in the first century. It's just unbelievable. If you don't believe that, then you can't believe any document in ancient history has any truthful to it whatsoever. So it was a phenomenal opportunity for Wes Huff. And the reason he got that opportunity is because he knew his core values, he knew his little area, and he stuck with it. He stuck with it, and eventually, God used it for his glory. We saw how the inauguration is about sticking to the core values, whether you like the person or not. I mean, our country's divided. For a while, there was, I believe, George Bush was the president. Then the people on the other side elected Barack Obama. And then after that, it was Trump. And then after that, it was Biden. And now it's Trump again. The real significance is not whether you like Obama and Biden or you like Bush and Trump. The real issue is the fact that you can have people with such divergent views of our country hand off power. And that is a phenomenal thing. And where does the value for that come from? Well, from our founding fathers. But where did they get the idea? Well, it came from the New Testament. You see, all of these things are examples of core values, and they illustrate what happens when you know what they are and you stick with them. Because if you don't, then it has deadly consequences, and the LA fires are a perfect example of that. Now, one of the things that we looked into was the first chapter of the Gospel according to John. And we showed how that chapter was so significant in the development of the early core values over the centuries that have driven Western civilization. And that was this, is that number one, Jesus is the Logos. He's the living truth. Number two, Jesus is God. Number three, Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. And number four, we know God by knowing Jesus. So we can now know the core values of God. So there's no more guessing, no more wondering, no more feeling like you're a pawn in the game of the Roman pagan gods. And what this did is it created a single repository of values. We could go to Jesus, look at Jesus, what he taught, and say, this is a representation. It is an explanation of the core values of God. There's one place, Jesus Christ, where you can look and understand the values of God, and we could implement them. And every time we do that, things get better in the world. And that over time brought a conviction of values. It brought a clarification of values, a foundation of values. And that results in a resolve of values. And it allows people to stay committed to them no matter what. Now, I'd like to read another passage and add to this body of evidence about how we know where our values can come from, how we know that they're authentic, and how we should have a resolve to never abandon them. And that's the letter that Paul wrote to Colossae. It's Colossians chapter 1, and he begins in this little section, verse 13. And he's talking about Jesus. He goes, now, for he delivered us, the he here is referring to God. God delivered us from the domain of darkness. So a domain to them was like a kingdom, okay? And he transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. And he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So what you see here is Paul is specifically showing us that when we know Jesus, we know God, because Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn of all creation. Now here's where it gets really good. Verse 16. For by him, by Jesus, all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself might come to have first place in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things unto himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. Now, notice what he's saying in this passage. Number one, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. When you see Jesus, you're seeing God. Jesus is the creator. That's a very, he says, for by Jesus, all things were created, both in heaven and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. Therefore, the core values of all thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities fall under the creator. So when we know Jesus, we see our core values, and those core values should be what drive all political systems. All thrones, dominions, rulers, or authorities fall under the authority of the creator. In other words, nations and empires can't come up with their own core values, because when they do, it's a disaster. And that's what we see. I want you to see a couple videos, and I want you to see how our basis for core values is weakening. And there's a group of people who have a lot of influence in our culture, society today, who have a very progressive ideology. And here is a reporter talking about the reaction of these progressive thinkers in America after the CEO of the United Healthcare company was assassinated in the streets of Manhattan. Let's listen.
We have normalized an ideology that suggests that certain people, because of their identity, because of their jobs, or because of their political outlook, are somehow ripe and, in fact, justifiable targets for violence. The very same group of people, Bill and Dana, who like to tell us that silence is violence, are going out and justifying the cold-blooded murder of a father of two. How does that comport? How do you make sense of that? And the only way you make sense of it is if you understand that they are operating from a principle in which certain groups are acceptable targets and other groups are unacceptable ones. Other groups are protected. And this is kind of a Manichaean view of the world that is absolutely unacceptable. Either political violence is wrong or it isn't. What we know for sure is that you cannot have a functioning liberal democracy like the one we have and accept that certain people are allowed to be murdered in the streets of Manhattan.
What you see here is what happens when we as a nation lose the source of our core values. We start to normalize ideologies that have core values that are completely different from those of Jesus. Western civilization was built upon, advanced on, developed on the core values that came from Jesus. There's no question of this. But progressive ideology, it believes that there are people in certain groups that are deserving of political violence. And this group of thinkers are taking their core values not from the traditional Western civilization values, but from Marxist ideology as articulated by the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. And what they're saying is because this group is a group of oppressors, then they deserve violence against them. So what happens when you start to abandon the source of our core values? What happens when we say, well, our core values should come from a Marxist ideology articulated by the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory? We should view the world through this lens. We should redefine what and who is deserving of political violence and who is not. Well, I want you to listen to a follow-up video, and this is from Dennis Prager. And I'd like you to listen to what he has to say when we lose the source of our core values.
The death of Christianity frightens me. Name me one ideology that has supplanted Christianity that has done good for humanity. When people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything. We have entered a post-Christian, or really post-Judeo-Christian, world of the absurd. This Jew is very frightened of a post-Christian society.
Now, isn't that interesting? This person is Jewish. He is not a follower of Christ. And yet, he says, I am fearful of a society that abandons, Christianity, because there's no ideology, there's no way of thinking that supplants it that is good for humanity. The reason why so many things are confusing in society today is because we're leaving the source, or we have abandoned the source of our core values. This is Dennis Prager's point. He's frightened of a post-Christian society. What does post-Christian mean? Well, it means that it's after Christian. And so we no longer hold that as a source of core values. The most important core value that has come out of Christianity is the definition of what it means to be a human being. This is called a worldview. In other words, Jesus defines what it means to be a human being, and he attributes value to every human being in the eyes of God. Case in point, for a long time, children were not valued. In Rome, infanticide was practiced at a remarkable rate. Also, children were not even considered, valuable until they reached the age of 10, 11, or 12. The reason why might have been pragmatic. Number one, lots of children died in childbirth, but also there was no, vaccinations, there was no antibiotics, medical care that could treat. So in some places, up to 50% of children would not reach the age of 10. And so you'd have lots of kids because lots of them would die for all various reasons. Maybe that pragmatically is why adults did not put a lot of value on children. That doesn't say that they didn't love kids, but maybe what happened is pragmatically when 50% of your kids die, you tend to emotionally maybe protect yourself. I'm just speculating here. I'm just trying to show that there was a rational reason why they didn't place a lot of value on children. And yet, Jesus himself said, let the children come unto me. And so he ascribed them value. Whether they grew up and became contributing members of society or could serve in the military, he said, even as children, just as children, they are valuable. Jesus brought value to women. In the Roman Empire, women were not really allowed to own property. Women were not allowed to testify or be used as witnesses for contracts or any other type of thing. Women could not, they just didn't have a lot of value. And yet the Lord basically ascribed tremendous value to females in the way that they followed him, called them disciples, and they were participants. So what I find really interesting is that Jesus articulates these core values based on a definition of a human being, and he ascribes them value. If we abandon the source of our core values, Jesus, what do we end up with? Well, we end up with things like, people in these groups are allowed to be killed. Let me give you a few examples. Jesus is the one who taught that the weaponization of justice was wrong. He says it's wrong to be unequal in your application of justice. There is nothing just, ethical, or righteous about the taking of innocent life as hostages or killing innocent people for a political cause. Yet Hamas and the Save Palestine movement in America says that because these innocent Israelis are Jewish or Israelis, they are not innocent and they're deserving of death. This Hamas movement and the Save Palestine movement in America today believes that they were justified in the terrorist attack on October 7th, that they were justified in taking hostages, that they were justified in the murder of young women and moms and babies and children, and then taking them as hostages and then raping them and sexually assaulting them and beating them, that somehow this was ethical. The only way a person can do that is if your definition of humanity is that we're not all the same, it's that we're all different, and that they're in a group that deserves this. That's called dehumanization. And whenever we do that, we see such horrific evil take place, and it just doesn't stop. Inversely speaking, it was the Germans who taught that Jews were lesser people, right? And that everybody else who wasn't of the pure Aryan race, Nietzsche called them the superhuman, that there was no way that you could have the same rights. In the medieval times, there was this notion of the divine right of kings, where the church tried to support, and the Roman Catholic Church tried to support the notion that kings had better blood than everybody else. They had more value. And so that was God's divine right that they had to rule over other people. Well, it's just malarkey, right? You look at slavery. Slavery is a notion that, because these people were chattel slavery from a different ethnic group, that they weren't fully human. And so what happens when we abandon our core values? Horrible, horrible things happen. Now, in regards to slavery, there's going to be critics or skeptics who listen to this podcast, and they're going to say, it was, America was founded as a racist country to support slavery, and it was a Christian country. That's all poppycock. That is ridiculous stupidity. And it's so ignorant. The bottom line is that the oldest institution in the world is slavery. And up until about the 1700s, all slavery was localized, and it was basically what that means is people who were weaker ethnic populations were taken over. As a matter of fact, the word slave comes from the root word Slavic, which was a group of white people in Eastern Europe that were taken and enslaved. More Slavs were enslaved by the Muslim nations than all of the Africans that were brought over to South America and North America combined. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing, the numbers. The issue is this. This is the point. Slavery has always existed. The question isn't who enslaved who. The question ultimately is who stopped it and why. And that has to do with core values. And because the source of core values were outside, right? They were objective of humans in Western civilization. It was pointed out that they weren't living up to the core values from the source from which they took them, God. So the movements to get rid of slavery were all Christian in nature. You cannot find an abolitionist movement that was not based in Christianity. And so that's why it is so important. Let me keep going. It was Jesus who taught that leaders have a responsibility to seek and do what is best for all people. Jesus is the one who taught that if you want to be great in the kingdom of God, you must be the servant of all. And so that is really a significant point. The fact that there was a massive improvement on the loss of acreage to fire in California in the 1900s is significant. It went from millions of acres being lost down to only 250,000 acres in any given year. And that proves that the leaders held to the core value that people were of high value. However, now it is back to losing California millions of acres, and even lives are being lost. What does this show? Well, the leaders currently have abandoned the core values, particularly the ones that Jesus taught that were the foundation for leadership, and that is to serve the people, not your own agenda. This is what happens when you adopt a source for core values. They're in opposition to the ultimate source for core values. It was Jesus who taught that we should love our enemies, even our political enemies. And that's why we can have a peaceful transfer of power. This is why we can have an inauguration, and it can be a celebration. And so, I just want to show how these are illustrations of core values. And if we have a resolve to stick to those core values, then things go better. If we abandon our core values or try to adopt core values from a new source, things go really poorly. Today, it's getting easier and easier for people to abandon Western civilization core values because people no longer believe that core values can come from Jesus. So I want to wrap up today's podcast by simply challenging you in this way. If you want to navigate the craziness of what's going on in our world, then know where your core values come from and clarify them. If you want your marriage to be stronger and you want it to grow and develop, then know where your core values come from, Jesus, and then clarify those core values. If you want your children protected, if you want to raise them in a way that their character is developed and that they live successful lives of adults and they're protected from all this craziness in the world, then you better tell them the source of core values and help them clarify those core values. The more you know Jesus, then the more solid your foundation will be, because you'll know where your core values come from and you'll know clearly what they are. I hope that this week's podcasts have helped you understand how to grow your faith and the things that you can think about and develop. As I say, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I want you to consider and think these things and decide for yourself. I also would hope that you would help the Salty Pastor podcast grow. This is a listener-supported ministry. You can go to our YouTube channel, The Salty Pastor, click on the like button and subscribe. The more subscribers we get, then the more the algorithm helps. Also, if you go to our website, you can look up any podcasts from the past. You can search based on passages of scripture. You can even search based on topic. And so if you'd avail yourself of that, that's awesome. You could become a regular donor to the Salty Pastor. Shout out to all of you who are doing that. But if you could join them, it would be much appreciated. As I'd like to say whenever I sign off, as a Salty Pastor, remember, it's important to always think for yourself.